This true story happened in 2024 and touched the hearts of everyone who heard it. A little boy abandoned within the cold walls of a hospital seemed to have disappeared from the world until one young woman decided to fight for his life and happiness. What began as a fragile hope became a powerful example of how one person can change another's fate. In a small provincial hospital, filled with the sterile scent of disinfectant, the usual routine played out. Footsteps echoed in the hallways, medical charts rustled, quiet conversations among staff blended into the monotonous background. Emotions were rare here, but behind one of the doors in a corner of the children's ward, there was a silent island of despair. There in the ward for abandoned children lay a tiny boy. His frail body was nearly lost in the oversized blanket. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and it was clear he was unwell. But he did not cry or call for help. His dry, cracked lips barely moved, letting out only the faintest whimper. It was as if he already knew that no one would hear him. Days stretched into eternity, and the world outside his hospital room had long ceased to exist. No one looked into his eyes, no one tried to talk to him. The nurses came in only for routine procedures, indifferently noting his condition in his chart, but there was no real care. He was just another case, one among hundreds. That very day, a young woman arrived at the hospital, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Tiffany stood at the reception desk, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Her slender figure and dark hair, tied in a messy bun, made her stand out against the weary medical staff. It was her first time here as a volunteer, driven by a desire to do at least something good. Indifference had always scared her, and today she decided she could no longer just watch from the sidelines. She was met by Deborah Blount, the head nurse of the department, a strict woman with slightly tired eyes. After explaining Tiffany's duties, she added in a restrained tone, "Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. We have a ward for abandoned children, and that's not your concern." Tiffany only nodded but couldn't stop thinking about that strange word, abandoned. Something inside her felt uneasy. She understood that behind this term lay real pain. At the end of her shift, she finally made up her mind. Tiffany quietly opened the door to the room where the boy lay. Her eyes fell on his tiny fists, clutching the edge of the blanket. She froze for a moment, then, unable to hold back, whispered, "You're not alone. I'm here." Those words, escaping her lips, became the beginning of a story that would change not only the boy's life, but her own as well. After that night, Tiffany couldn't get the image of the boy out of her head. His eyes, filled with silence and an almost unnatural understanding, haunted her thoughts. She couldn't fathom how a child, just beginning his life, had already encountered such loneliness. The next day, Tiffany arrived at the hospital earlier than scheduled. She went straight to the ward, carefully avoiding Deborah Blount. Opening the door, she saw the baby again. He lay just as still, as if afraid to attract attention that would inevitably pass him by. But this time, Tiffany noticed something else. His blanket was carelessly crumpled. His formula bottle lay on the floor, and white traces of milk were visible on his lips. A chill ran down her spine. "Oh, sweetheart, how could they let this happen?" she exhaled, sitting beside his crib. She gently picked up the bottle, wiped it with a tissue from her bag, and refilled it with fresh formula from a small thermos she had brought. Noticing her movement, the baby weakly turned his head. His tiny eyes barely opened, but for the first time, a flicker of something new appeared in them. Hope. Tiffany felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, wrapping him in the blanket. "I promise." From that moment on, Tiffany spent time with him every day. She learned how to feed him, change his diapers, and monitor his condition. Sometimes she noticed the odd looks from other nurses, but no one stopped her. It seemed that in this hospital, people had grown so accustomed to indifference that any attempt to change something was no longer taken seriously. One day, after witnessing yet another sign of neglect in the boy's care, Tiffany couldn't hold back any longer. She marched straight to the nurse's station, where Deborah Blount sat flipping through medical charts. "Why do you treat him like this?" Tiffany began, her voice trembling with anger. "He's a child, not just another case in your records." Deborah Blount looked up. Her eyes held a mix of exhaustion and puzzlement. "Tiffany, you've been here for just a month. Do you think you can save everyone? We have dozens of children like him. If you start caring about each one, you won't last long. Her voice was cold but not cruel, rather filled with bitter resignation. But that doesn't mean you should ignore them, Tiffany countered firmly. One person can't help everyone, but that's no excuse to abandon each one. Deborah Blount sighed and shook her head. You'll understand in time. Everyone has their limits. But Tiffany had not reached hers yet. She vowed to herself that she would do everything possible to give this little boy the love he had been denied. With each passing day, Tiffany grew more attached to him. She named him Simon. The name had come to her naturally the moment she saw him smile for the first time. Simon was getting stronger. His cheeks became slightly rounder, his eyes brighter, and his tiny hand reached for her fingers more often. Tiffany knew that her care was making him healthier, but she couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. Every time she left the hospital, it felt like everything was too fragile, like a glass sphere that could shatter at any moment. Her fears were confirmed unexpectedly. One evening, as she left Simon's room, she overheard a conversation between Deborah Blount and the head of the department. Their voices were low, but Tiffany stopped behind the corner and strained to listen. The abandoned children need to be transferred, the department head said matter-of-factly. The orphanage is ready to take several of them. We are a hospital, not a daycare. But the conditions there, Deborah hesitated. Her voice was uncertain. They won't survive there, especially kids like Simon. We have no choice, the department head cut in sharply. We can't keep them here forever. Let the orphanage handle it. Tiffany barely stopped herself from bursting into the room, her heart clenched with fear. An orphanage. She pictured Simon there, helpless, abandoned once again. The thought was unbearable. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but when she entered the room, her face betrayed the storm of emotions inside her. You want to send him to an orphanage, she demanded, unable to hide her outrage. But he's only just started getting better. That will destroy him. The department head turned to her with visible irritation. Tiffany, you're a volunteer, not the hospital director. Your opinion matters, but we make the decisions. But he's a child. He needs care, love, not neglect. Tiffany spoke firmly, though her voice trembled. This isn't just paperwork. This is his life. Deborah Blount, perhaps trying to soften the tension, interjected. Tiffany, I understand that you care, but no, you don't understand, Tiffany interrupted, looking straight at the department head. If you won't give him a chance, I will. I'll find a family for Simon. Silence filled the room. The department head scoffed. A family? In just a few days? You have no idea what you're up against. I'll try, Tiffany said stubbornly, feeling a fire of determination ignite within her. She left without waiting for a reply. Her mind was racing, her heart tight with desperation. But she knew one thing for sure. If she did nothing, Simon would lose everything. Tiffany had made up her mind. She would do everything in her power to save this little boy. The next day, Tiffany arrived at the hospital with firm determination. She had spent the entire night researching adoption laws, charity organizations, and foundations that help abandoned children. In her hands was a long list of phone numbers and addresses, and in her mind, just one thought. She didn't have much time. Her first stop was Deborah Blount, hoping the nurse would support her, even just a little. But when Deborah heard Tiffany's plan, she simply shook her head. Tiffany, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into, she said quietly, sinking into her chair exhausted. Adoption is a process that takes months, if not years. Even if a family's found, they won't have time to finalize anything. But I have to try, Tiffany insisted stubbornly. I can't just stand by and do nothing, knowing he'll end up in an orphanage. Deborah sighed and returned to her work, leaving Tiffany alone in the hallway with her thoughts. But Tiffany wasted no time. She began calling every number on her list. Each conversation felt like a battle. She had to explain, persuade, sometimes even beg. Most responses were formal. We will certainly review your request. But then, one voice on the other end of the line changed everything. Your story really moved me, said a woman from a charitable foundation. We'll do our best to help. Give us a few days. Tiffany's heart skipped a beat. This was the first ray of hope after hours of struggle. She thanked the woman, hung up the phone, and for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to smile. But there was no time to rest. While the foundation searched for a family, Tiffany continued caring for Simon. She checked his temperature, brought him toys, and talked to him, even though he couldn't yet respond. Every time he looked at her with his big eyes, she felt her resolve grow even stronger. One evening, as Tiffany was feeding Simon, Deborah Blount walked into the room. She stood at the door, arms crossed, watching as Tiffany gently wiped the baby's mouth. "You're not giving up," she finally said, a hint of respect in her voice. Tiffany looked up and smiled. "I can't. If I give up now, he'll be completely alone." Deborah said nothing and walked out, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Tiffany knew her efforts were making a difference. Even in a place used to indifference, her determination was starting to spark change. The next day, Tiffany received a call. The voice on the other end sounded excited. "We found a family. They're ready to come tomorrow." Tiffany's heart pounded. This was the first real step towards saving Simon. But now she had to face the hardest part, letting him go. At first, Simon was wary of the couple, but as Tiffany softly hummed a lullaby, his tiny face relaxed. The man stood beside his wife, carefully supporting her as if afraid she might drop this precious little miracle. Tiffany watched them, barely holding back tears. They were the perfect family for Simon. She knew it, but the thought of never seeing him again, never holding him, never tucking him into a warm blanket, was unbearably painful. "Thank you," the woman said to Tiffany. "If it weren't for you, we never would have known about him." Tiffany nodded, afraid that if she spoke, her voice would betray her emotions. She stepped closer to Simon, gently touching his cheek. "You're going to be happy, little one," she whispered. "I know you will." The young couple headed toward the exit, holding Simon securely in their arms. Tiffany stood by the window, watching as they got into their car and drove away. Tears streamed down her face, tears of both joy and sorrow. She knew she had done everything she could for him. Now he would grow up in a loving home, but in her heart, there was an emptiness nothing could fill. She stepped outside into the hospital courtyard and, tilting her head toward the sky, whispered, "Goodbye, Simon." Days passed since Simon had left with his new family. Tiffany still came to the hospital, but everything felt different. His room was empty now. She tried not to look at the door, but her feet carried her there anyway, and each time her heart ached. The nurses noticed that Tiffany had become more withdrawn. Even Deborah Blount, who was used to her emotional outbursts, stopped her in the hallway one day. "You shouldn't be so hard on yourself," she said, crossing her arms. "You did more for him than anyone else. He's going to be okay." Tiffany gave a weak smile, but said nothing. Deborah's words couldn't erase the emptiness that had settled in her heart. She knew she had done the right thing, but the feeling that something was unfinished wouldn't leave her. One evening, as the hospital was wrapped in silence, Tiffany sat on a bench in the courtyard. The sky was covered in clouds with only a few stars peeking through. She held her phone, rereading a message from the charity organization. They thanked her for reaching out and said they were willing to collaborate if there were other children at the hospital in need of help. Tiffany knew there were many. She saw them every day. The lonely boy staring into the distance, the little girl no one came to visit, the babies whose cries went unanswered. Each one was just like Simon, but she couldn't save them all. That thought weighed heavily on her, but she wasn't going to give up. The next morning, she went to see the hospital's chief physician. He was an older man with gray hair and sharp features. Tiffany knew talking to him wouldn't be easy, but now she had more confidence. "I need to speak with you," she said, standing at his office door. "It's about the children who stay here." The doctor looked at her over his glasses and gestured for her to sit. Tiffany took a deep breath and placed her notes, phone numbers, and charity contacts on his desk. "I know we're short on resources," she said, "but these kids deserve a chance. If we can even partially collaborate with these organizations, their stories won't just get lost in paperwork." The chief doctor listened silently, then removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "Tiffany, what you did for that boy is admirable," he finally said. "But you realize this is a complicated process. Even with charities, we can't save them all. But we can save some," Tiffany said firmly. "If we don't do anything, nothing will change." For a few seconds, they stared at each other. Then at last, the chief doctor slowly nodded. All right, I'll think about it. But understand, this won't be easy. Tiffany walked out of his office with a sense of relief. It was a small victory, but she knew it was just the beginning. Now her mission was clear, to do everything she could to make sure every child got the love and care they deserved. In the evening, sitting by the window, she gazed at the city lights and thought that maybe Simon's story was just the beginning. Days at the hospital passed, and Tiffany started noticing the impact of her efforts. The charity organization not only continued its partnership with the hospital, but also helped provide resources, new cribs, formula, and toys for the babies. Deborah Blount no longer looked at Tiffany as a naive girl. In fact, she even started helping her care for other children, sometimes staying a few minutes past her shift. One evening, as Tiffany walked down the hallway, she heard a faint cry. She stopped, realizing the sound was coming from the infant ward. Peeking inside, she saw a tiny baby girl, her face red and her little hands clenched into fists. Tiffany stepped closer and gently picked the child up. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, rocking the baby in her arms. The girl slowly calmed down, resting against Tiffany's chest. At that moment, a warmth spread through Tiffany's heart. It reminded her of Simon and his first timid attempts to trust the world. But instead of sadness, she felt determination. Every child left behind deserved love and care, just like he did. The next day, the hospital's chief physician appeared unexpectedly. Tiffany was surprised when he stepped into the playroom, which the charity had helped set up for the children. He observed them playing for a long time before approaching her. "You know, you were right," he admitted with a hint of hesitation. "We can do more. Maybe not for everyone, and maybe not all at once, but step by step." He paused, then added, "Thank you for reminding us of that." Tiffany smiled, feeling hope bloom inside her. She knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but she wasn't alone. Slowly, change began to take root. Nurses became more attentive to the children, and more volunteers joined in. It seemed like the indifference that had lingered within the hospital walls for years was finally fading. A few weeks later, Tiffany received an unexpected letter. Inside was a photo of Simon with his new family. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys, his face beaming with a wide smile. The sadness that Tiffany had seen in his eyes that first day was gone, replaced by joy and the confidence that he was loved. She stared at the photo for a long time, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to stop them. These were tears of happiness and relief. Slipping the picture into her notebook, she wrote a simple phrase beside it: "Every small action matters." That evening, as she stepped into the hospital courtyard, Tiffany lifted her gaze to the stars. Her heart felt at peace. She knew the path she had chosen wouldn't be easy, but every child saved made the world a little brighter. She closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered, "One by one, we'll make a difference." Thank you for listening to this heartfelt story until the end. We truly believe that each of you has the power to make the world a little better, just like Tiffany did. Let us know in the comments what you think about her actions. Have you ever faced similar situations, or do you know someone who has done something just as kind? Don't forget to like this video if the story touched your heart, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Share this video with your friends and loved ones. Perhaps it will inspire someone today. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful to have you here. See you soon with another incredible story that will appear on your screen very soon. So what are you willing to do today to change someone's world? Let us know in the comments.